Introduction to Surah Al-Anfal in Ma'arif al-Quran. The Ma'arif al-Quran introduces Surah Al-Anfal as the first surah revealed after a pivotal military conflict, the Battle of Badr, to Al-Hijri. It marks a transition from the purely ideological struggle in Makkah to the physical defense of the Muslim community in Medina. Its revelations provide divine guidance on the rules of war, the distribution of spoils, and the moral psychology of the believers in conflict. Key introductory points. The name Al-Anfal, the spoils of war, is named after the first verse, which asks about the distribution of the spoils of war. This immediately establishes its central theme. Central theme. The overarching theme is the laws and ethics of divinely sanctioned warfare, jihad, and the spiritual prerequisites for victory. It transforms tribal raiding into a disciplined, principled struggle for truth. Context. Revealed after the stunning Muslim victory at Badr, where small, ill-equipped force of 313 Muslims defeated a well-armed Quraysh army of about 1,000. The surah analyzes the causes of this victory and lays down the foundational rules for future conflicts. Detailed thematic commentary outline. Following the Ma'arif al-Quran's approach, the surah's guidance can be divided into the following major segments. Part 1. The laws of spoils and the purpose of war, verses 1 to 19. The surah begins by addressing the immediate practical question on the believers' minds. Sovereignty over spoils, verse 1. The opening verse establishes that the question of spoils is settled. They ask you about the spoils of war. Say, the spoils of war belong to Allah and His Messenger. The Ma'arif al-Quran explains that this means they are not the property of any individual fighter, but a collective trust to be distributed by the leader, the Prophet, according to divine guidance for the benefit of the entire community. The true believers, verses 2 to 4. The description of the true believers is placed here to highlight that the right to spoils is linked to the quality of faith. True believers are those whose hearts tremble when Allah is mentioned, whose faith increases when His verses are recited, and who spend in His cause. Divine support at Badr, verses 7 to 19. The surah recounts the Battle of Badr not as a human achievement, but as a divine decree and intervention. Allah's promise to grant one of the two parties, the trade caravan or the Quraysh army, to the Muslims was fulfilled. Victory came through divine help, through sleep as a source of tranquility, rain for purification and firm footing, and the unseen army of angels. This section establishes that victory comes from Allah, not merely from numbers or equipment. Part 2. Obedience to Allah and His Messenger, verses 20 to 28, 45 to 47. A recurring theme in the surah is the absolute necessity of unity and obedience for a believing community at war. A call to obedience, verse 20. O you who have believed, obey Allah and His Messenger, and do not turn away from Him while you hear His order. The metaphor of deaf and blind, verse 22. The worst of creatures in the sight of Allah are the deaf and dumb, those who do not reason. This emphasizes that following the Prophet requires active listening, understanding, and intellectual submission. The key to victory, verses 45 to 47. The believers are commanded to be firm and remember Allah much when they meet an enemy force. They are warned against the traits that lead to defeat, disputing among themselves, which causes failure and loss of power, and behaving arrogantly on earth like the people of the past. Part 3. Dealing with prisoners of war and the enemy, verses 57 to 58, 67 to 71. The Ma'arif al-Quran explains the revolutionary ethics of war introduced here. The principle of reciprocity and mercy, verse 57. So if you, O Muhammad, gain dominance over them in war, disperse by means of them those behind them, that perhaps they will be reminded. This allows for taking prisoners to weaken the enemy's resolve. The option of kindness, verse 58. It also permits setting prisoners free by grace or for ransom. This established a human framework for dealing with captives, a stark contrast to the pre-Islamic norms of slaughter. The criticism after Badr, verse 67. It is not for a prophet to have captives until he has extensively subdued the land. The commentary explains that this was a gentle criticism. Taking prisoners for ransom so early, before the enemy's power was completely broken, was not the ideal strategic choice, as it allowed the Quraysh to regroup. Part 4. The Internal Enemy. The Hypocrites and Their Plots, verses 25 to 27, 49 to 52. The surah warns that the external enemy is not the only threat. Beware of a trial that affects all, verse 25. And fear a trial which will not strike those who have wronged among you exclusively, and know that Allah is severe in penalty. The wrongdoing of some can bring calamity upon the entire community. The hypocrites fear, verses 49 to 52. The hypocrites who stayed behind or wavered said of the Muslim army, "These people are deluded by their religion." But the Quran retorts that the true promise of hell is for those who disbelieve, not the believers. Part 5. The Ultimate Lesson. Divine support is conditional, verses 53, 65 to 66. This is a central theological point of the surah. The law of divine change, verse 53. Indeed, Allah will not change the favor He has bestowed on a people until they change what is in themselves. Victory is not a permanent guarantee. It is contingent upon the community's continued faith, obedience, and moral state. The ratio of victory, verses 65 to 66. In a famous passage, Allah first states that with steadfastness, 20 believers can overcome 200, and 100 can overcome 1,000 disbelievers. Then, acknowledging human weakness, He lightens the burden, stating that if there are 100 steadfast, they can overcome 200. This shows that the spiritual strength of the believers is the real multiplier, but Allah is aware of their human limitations and is merciful. Part 6. The Importance of Solidarity and Preparation, verses 60, 72 to 75. The surah provides practical and strategic commands for the ongoing struggle. Military preparedness, verse 60. And prepare against them whatever you are able of power, and steeds of war, by which you may terrify the enemy of Allah and your enemy. The Ma'ariful Quran explains that this command includes all forms of military strength and technology relevant to the era, making it a perpetual obligation to maintain defensive capability. The Bonds of Faith, verses 72 to 75. This section delineates the new relationships established by faith. The believers are allies, awliya, to one another, superseding old tribal loyalties. It also outlines the responsibilities towards those who emigrated, muhajirin, and those who hosted them, ansar, and the rulings concerning believers who have not yet emigrated from Makkah. Conclusion in Ma'ariful Quran. The Ma'ariful Quran summarizes Surah Al-Anfal as the charter of Islamic Jihad. Its primary objectives are spiritualizing warfare. It transforms war from a quest for loot and glory into a disciplined struggle, jihad, for upholding truth, where the key weapons are faith, patience, piety, and remembrance of Allah. Establishing rules of engagement. It provides the initial laws for the ethical conduct of war, including the distribution of spoils, the treatment of prisoners, and the imperative of military preparedness. Analyzing the causes of victory. It clearly attributes the victory at Badr to divine assistance, which is in turn contingent upon the believer's spiritual state, their obedience, and their unity. Building a faith-based community. It forges a new social contract where the bonds of faith between Muhajirin and Ansar are stronger than the bonds of blood or tribe. In essence, Surah Al-Anfal provides the moral and legal framework for the Muslim community's physical survival and integrity. It teaches that victory in this world is not an end in itself, but a means to establish divine justice, and it is granted only to those who fulfill its spiritual and ethical conditions.